Okay, so I'm going to kind of take a step back. It's the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. So I wanted to talk a little bit about different frameworks within working for people or with people and so on, of which I see solidarity as one. In particular, I wanted to start off with humanitarianism. So Nadine talked a bit about kind of the state of humanitarianism in terms of the Palestinian economy. Humanitarianism is the prevalent ideology of NGOs, of organizations like the Red Cross. And these organizations make little distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed, right? Red Cross, in its mission statement, it says it's impartial, neutral, and independent, irrespective of the people involved and the situation on the ground. Irrespective of the situation on the ground. So for them, who is responsible for inflicting crises is not really important. For the humanitarian point, or the humanitarian framework, really what you have is you have crisis and you have relief. Okay, we have a crisis, we need to go and do some relief. Oh, here's the next crisis, we need to do some relief. It never attempts to deconstruct the structural reasons for the occurrence of such crises. I would argue that humanitarianism doesn't work for justice. And I think that what I'm going to talk about really is how these different frameworks interact with the concept of justice, particularly when it comes to Palestine. So under this humanitarian umbrella, you kind of have these subgroups, and one of which I would call like the peace or equivalence group, right? And for this group of NGOs or people who are working for some cause, the important thing are things like dialogue, right? So if only both sides would talk to each other, or if only there was peace, right? So in this, there's an implicit burden on the oppressed persons, or the oppressed people, to convince the oppressor that, oh, we are actually people, right? What does it accomplish for the oppressed to talk to the oppressor? I don't see that it accomplishes very much. I think that historically in Palestine, we've seen that it's done little except make the oppressor feel bad. In addition, this kind of draws an equivalence between the resistance and oppression, right? So if the only important thing is peace and not justice, then it doesn't matter whether the lack of peace is coming because of resistance to injustice or whether it's coming because of an oppressor. It's all the same. All we have to do is stop violence. This is what the peace process is doing, right? The peace process isn't trying to come up with a just answer to the Palestinian cause or what's going on. It's basically just as long as there's no fighting, then everything is okay. NGOs, like Nadine talked about, which I would say is part of this humanitarianism structure, they really work to build support structures for, to build support for power structures that either exist or would be beneficial for those in power to already exist, right? So building up Fatah in Palestine. One of the most ridiculous things that I know about is that there's an initiative from the Estonian government. The Estonian government has given $1 million to the Palestinian Authority to implement iGovernment. Basically, like set up electronic infrastructure so you could go online to get your driver's license or your permit for this or your permit for that. This is, like you said, bureaucratic capitalism at its finest. Like, instead of actually tackling, root causes for oppression, you're building almost ridiculous pieces of infrastructure, of which there is at least not yet a demonstrable need, right? So then you have humanitarianism, and then you have human rights. And the human rights framework is predicated on the idea that justice is basically just granting this list of rights. So if we could enumerate all of the particular rights that people should have, then all one has to do in order for there to be justice is to make sure those rights are happening. This, I don't know, I think it's kind of, I think it's a ridiculous framework. I think that human rights always creates exceptions for those in power. So whether you're violating human rights or not, it doesn't matter if you are the people in power. The United States has a long history of violating human rights. The United States is still violating human rights. The United States does, commits torture, commits whatever, but is never held accountable, right? So already there's no accountability in this framework. In addition, what happens if this list of human rights is missing something? The UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was written in 1948, does not include an explicit right, for example, for sexual freedom. As René Guillon, who is a sexologist, really a sociologist, he wrote a long article in 1951 talking about how the UN Declaration of Human Rights, instead of granting a right for sexual freedom, actually has language that does the opposite. So in Article 29, it says that the rights listed here can be subject to limitations for the purposes of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and general welfare in a democratic society. So in other words, any of these rights could be limited if it's necessary in order to have public order. And in fact, the word morality being in there, I think, is most objectionable, right? Because morality is always used to limit freedom when it comes to sexual rights. So because of this, I don't think that we can rely on an enumeration of human rights to grant justice or to be a framework within to work, right? If this list of human rights is actually being granted to a people, that does not necessarily mean that there is justice there. I do think they're useful in that if you know that human rights are being violated, clearly something is wrong. They're just a baseline, right? But that's not like the ultimate goal. And that's where solidarity comes in. So solidarity has to be based on something. And I'm not talking about solidarity in like the critical theory sense where it's constructed by like a symmetric relationship between two peoples, right? It's one stands in for the other. And I don't think that that's really a just solidarity. The people who are oppressed and people who are working in solidarity with them have to realize that there's a difference, right? I don't have guns pointed at my head every time I walk from school to home like you do in Berkeley, in Hebrew, for example, right? There is a difference between me and somebody in Palestine. And I think that's really important to remember because one of the issues with solidarity is that solidarity not based on universal justice can result in things like appropriation or limitation or working to selective justice. We have to be careful as people working in solidarity not to try to dictate the direction of movements of other people. In particular, one of the things Nadine was talking about was BDS, right? So the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is originating from Palestinian civil society. They're the ones who are asking those working in solidarity to boycott, to push for divestment, and to push for sanctions against companies operating and profiting from injustice in Palestine. So it's important to look at the oppressed people we are working in solidarity for leadership, right? It can't just be that, oh, I think I'm working for freedom for Filipinos and I'm going to decide this is how it's going to happen. I'm going to decide. That I think is not an appropriate role for those working in solidarity. In addition, I think that when not working with, for justice-based solidarity, one potential thing that can happen is, working for the glory of a particular ideology or a particular religion or a particular political system, right? If I'm doing something just for the glory of communism, well, maybe that's not true solidarity. In my opinion, really, what one should be working for is universal justice. And I think that this selectiveness is really common when it comes to Palestine. You see a lot of people working in solidarity for whom all of a sudden the question of Palestine is different from any other form, any other question that they may be working in solidarity for. So I'm going to name some names. So Regina Spektor. How many of you guys have heard of Regina Spektor?
I know you have.
So Regina Spektor is like this indie artist. She's originally Russian. She's in New York, whatever. She did a concert for Darfur, did a concert for Tibet. She did a fundraiser at the Bowery for Planned Parenthood. She did a thing for Haiti. But when it came to Israel, during Israel's attempted obliteration of Gaza in 2009, she basically said that any criticism of Israel is thinly veiled anti-Semitism. So this exceptionalism is really common, right? We also have Libby Post, who is a queer activist in New York, who wrote this infamous article called Israel, It's the Gay Thing to Do, in which who is self-identified queer and queer activist, says, for the first time in my life, I'm actually in full agreement with what the Israeli armed forces are doing. This is, of course, during the invasion of Gaza. And she asks in this article, ironically enough, what should Israel do? Just bend over and take it? So even in her her decision to selectively work for justice, she uses a homophobic metaphor, despite being a well-known queer activist. And I think that the last thing I want to say about solidarity is that more and more we have to understand that the power structure in the world is no longer making a distinction between nonviolent and violent resistance. Nadim talked about a few of these things, Armel talked about a few too, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear that for the power structure, there is no distinction between violence and nonviolence. You have the State Department calling WikiLeaks a terrorist organization, right? You have essentially these witch hunts happening through the use of the grand jury system. The material support clause, which Nadim alluded to, has basically made it so that even meeting with members of an organization that the US State Department deems to be a terrorist organization is a crime. So this distinction of violence and nonviolence in terms of resistance, I think because the power structure is beginning to make less distinction between them, I think in talking about solidarity, we also have to recognize that oppressed peoples have the right to resist by any means necessary, which is actually a part of the human rights international law that I was talking about earlier. So to summarize, I just wanted to kind of talk a bit about the different frameworks that I see people working under, and to say that I don't think we can rely on humanitarianism, NGOs, human rights, or solidarity based on anything except universal justice, because that is really the only way that we can bridge these connections between peoples and work for justice for everyone.